The next part of the lecture, we're going to be looking at the mid to late 1960s. A return to childhood and a return to the past. So we're picking up our narrative in 1964, the 60s. It was the time of youth. It was called the youthquake. The boomers were on the rise. They were earning money now. They were working. It was a prosperous time. And the boomers wanted to spend all of their money on themselves. And quite rightly. You could not be too young in the 60s. It was all about a return to childhood, to the playfulness of being a child. This was a reaction to just how scary the adult world actually was. Take a look at this picture of Twiggy and another model. We'll meet Twiggy again later. Look at their posture like gangly toddlers. The youthquake. It was all about being as childlike as possible. It was the era of the Beatles. Imagine, after Kennedy's assassination, the world so frightened and confused and traumatized by what had happened. This beautiful young guy, his head blown off by an assassin. A lone assassin? I don't know, you tell me. But it was traumatic. Suddenly, these four young boys, all cheeky and charming with this incredible music, arrived in America on their first tour. They were like a tonic of sunshine and fun, and they all had those funny accents like that, didn't they? People fell in love with the Beatles. It was the era of the civil rights movement, where we met and then sadly lost too quickly beautiful guys like Martin Luther King, assassinated, and Malcolm X, assassinated. The 60s was a season of assassinations. It started with JFK, of course, at the end of 1963, but then Martin Luther King was assassinated, Malcolm X was assassinated, Robert Kennedy, JFK's brother, was assassinated. A terrifying time, made all the more so by the Vietnam War, a war that was so mindless and pointless that people really didn't know why they were fighting. People were drafted into the war in Vietnam. Young guys would get their draft card in the post, and they would have to go off to Southeast Asia and kill or be killed in a war that made no sense to them. The Vietnam War, and of course the protest against it. No wonder so many people turned to psychedelic hallucinatory drugs, wanting to escape from this world that seemed increasingly terrifying. The 60s were an age of dichotomies. At the end of the decade, we sent a man to the moon. And yet, we wanted to dress up like Victorian soldiers. You hold on to your hats. The 60s was something else. Before we go on, I have to make a really important point so as to avoid any confusion. The 60s had three fashion ideas. The early 60s, it was a continuation of what we've looked at already. A modified new look and that boxy slim silhouette. The mid-60s, the miniskirt, this return to childlike, brightly coloured toddler wear. And then the late 60s, floating, nostalgic and romantic, often with a bit of an ethnic flavour. Because these three ideas are so dramatically different, people often get confused and think they come from different decades. As a consequence, the floating and eclectic style we associate with hippies is often misunderstood as originating in the 70s. The hippie movement, short-lived though it was, and what people think of as hippie style, had absolutely nothing to do with the 70s. Hippies were a product of the 60s, and the short-lived hippie movement had died by the time that the 70s dawned. Anyone left hanging on to hippie ideals or fashion seen as a bit of a joke in the new me generation decade of the deco revival, glam rock, and later disco and punk rock. Right, hope I've cleared that up. Once and for all. Well, you know what, we can't even begin to talk about 1960s fashion unless we first talk about the decade's cultural hotspot. England, known as Swinging England. Of course, the Beatles were the ambassadors for Swinging England, this place that seemed so exciting and cool and free and happy compared to everywhere else in the world, especially America, so traumatized in the wake of Kennedy's assassination. Race riots, Vietnam, all of this stuff that seemed so dark and so scary. England seemed so fun and light-hearted in comparison. Fashion. In the 1960s, the focus of fashion switched from Paris to England, all centered on Carnaby Street. That was the happening place for fashion. The British invasion was a musical and cultural invasion that everybody embraced. Okay, the Beatles were the first of the British invasion bands, but they were soon followed by the Rolling Stones and the Kinks and Herman's Hermits and the Who. I could go on just naming British invasion bands and artists who stormed the charts in America in the 1960s. This was the mod generation. The mods were actually an English counterculture of guys who rode around on Italian scooters and wore really smart, cool suits and loved the Union Jack and houndstooth check and all of that. But then the expression mod just became kind of a catch-all phrase for everything that was young and hip and cool in the 60s. Here is The Who. They were a mod band, and look at the stripes, the houndstooth, the Union Jack. This is the mod look. And of course, James Bond. The original James Bond. This is Sean Connery, 007. He was from England, although Sean Connery himself was from Scotland. Sean Connery, 007, Miss Moneypenny. That is my Sean Connery impression, and I promise I won't do it again. No wonder everyone wanted the London look, and you're going to see how they got it. Because of Swinging London, the direction of fashion flips. Traditionally, fashion worked like this. It would start with a couturier, like Christian Dior. Here he is. He would then show his collection of couture, which his clients, very rich ladies, would buy, and they would have it made for them. Couture means sewing. His collection would feature in fashion magazines for everybody to see, and his ideas would then be knocked off at every level of retail until regular women on the street wore it. That's how fashion always worked. The 60s changed all that. The influence of fashion started filtering up from the street and worked like this. Kids on the streets of London would start doing incredible or different things to fashion. This would be noticed by a designer who would make a collection that would go straight into a boutique to be sold. Then the couture houses would take note and adapt these ideas for their own, much higher priced clientele. And then the other side of real life retail would look at what the couturiers had done and sell it to women on the street. So this is how the cycle changed. It started on the street and ended on the street, but note, very different street. You get that, right? So take a look up there, the new look. I'll just explain all this again in a nutshell. Christian Dior invented the new look. The idea came from his brain. That's where the idea came from, his brain. And it was then knocked off by everyone. Take a look here. Mary Quant did not invent the miniskirt, but she was the first to notice that girls on the street were hemming their skirts shorter and responded by designing clothes to sell in her own boutique that had shorter hems. Then her designs were knocked off by mass retailers, but not before. They also influenced couturiers who adapted street style for their own customer. Their designs then knocked off by mass retailers, etc., etc. And that is still more or less the cycle of fashion as we know it. Now let's have some more fun, because I know that a lot of you love it when we do the body ideal. Let's do the body ideal of the 60s. I think you already know what it is. Here it is. Tall, gangly, small breasts, childlike, narrow hips and long skinny legs. Not boyish. Nobody wanted to look like a boy. They wanted to look like a child. And of course this was the perfect body for the mini. These A-line, simple, rather childlike shift dresses. Let's give her a cheeky John Lennon cap, a mod bag, and a Beatle album, and she's ready for Carnaby Street. Did anybody actually have this body? Well, a lot of people did. Twiggy, of course, had this body. Twiggy, I'm sure you all know who she is, but just in case, she was a 16-year-old supermodel from London. She was a Cockney, which meant she had like a Cockney accent like that, very cheeky, you know, didn't talk like a Prof H, or like the narrator of that video, who was, of that film clip, who was oh so posh. She was young, she was fresh, she was working class. This is when the working class came up and became a force to be reckoned with too, and the world loved Twiggy. Who else had this body? Diana Ross had this body. Pattie Boyd, she was George Harrison of the Beatles' husband, his wife. And later on, her husband was Eric Clapton, and she was an it girl on the swinging London scene. But they all had this skinny adolescent look, perfect for the fashion of the era. Let's look at the 1960s beauty ideal, very achievable with makeup. Let's start with our 21st century generic girl, and the first thing we have to do is give her some very natural but high arched brows. The higher the arch, the larger you could make your eye, because you left more space, didn't you? The idea was to achieve a very, very large and very round eye. And this was achieved by a very strange technique. Women of the 60s would use a pencil to draw this arch right in the deep socket of their eye. Then they would add eyeliner to the lid, so you're creating a very round shape to the eye, all of it enhanced with enormous false eyelashes. In fact, the lashes on the bottom were often drawn on with a pencil, like a doll. This is how you achieve the eye of these birds. That was the slang term in the 60s for English girls, birds. Blush was bright and high on the cheek, and lipstick was light, pale pinks or even white sometimes. We'll give her a flower, because we're getting into the flower power era when people did start painting flowers on their cheeks, etc. And we'll give her a nice mod haircut. We'll look at 60s hair in a second. And there we have it. This is the ideal beauty of the 1960s. And look, we've transformed her completely into Twiggy. Now here's something nifty. Here are a series of images of Twiggy herself showing how to achieve this makeup look. And you can see there she is painting on that deep crease in the eye socket, adding her eyeliner and her false eyelashes, of course, and then drawing on or painting on there the eyelashes beneath. But this really was the beauty ideal across the board. The idea was to make your face as childlike as possible, with these huge eyes like a toddler has, or like a doll. But hey, this was perfect because people dressed like toddlers and dolls. Let's take a look at 60s hair. It was geometric. These dramatic geometric bobs. See? That one's very weird. And they were all created by Vidal Sassoon. He was really the first big celebrity hairdresser who marketed his own line of hair products. Very geometric, very modern, very fun, very cool. Your hair would swing down over your face as you were dancing. It was great fun. The dominant fashion idea. Basically, there it is. The A-line mini dress. Mid-60s fashion was a return to childlike innocence in an increasingly frightening world. Look at that dress. A toddler could wear that. Kennedy's assassinations, race riots, the burgeoning Vietnam War, and the ongoing Cold War were all blamed on parents. And the embrace of such childlike attire was the sartorial expression of the generation gap, wasn't it? With the young adopting clothing that their parents could not possibly wear. Or so they thought. Believe me, there were plenty of middle-aged women who embraced the miniskirt. The designer of the decade was this lady with her Vidal Sassoon haircut. Mary Quant, and that's her very iconic flower logo. And this is what Mary did. She will always be the first to say that she did not invent the miniskirt. She was the first person to notice what was going on the street. The kids hanging around Carnaby Street were hemming their skirts, so she started to design clothing that responded. It was bright, it was childlike, it was fun. Look at this central image. All of these girls looking up at the camera like toddlers, like a child looking up at a grown-up. Op art, pop art, bright, colourful, fun. Mary was fun. When she launched a makeup line, look, Mary Quant crayons. These are eyeline pencils, but she called them crayons to make it fun, to make it childlike. I met Mary Quant when I was a very little girl. My dad had to go to her office on some business. In case you don't know, my dad is David Wolfe, the guy who invented fashion forecasting. And he took me along to Mary Quant's office. And I think she gave me some pencils to draw with or something, I don't know. But the story goes, and I don't really remember any of this, but I sat on her desk, and she was incredibly famous at that point. She was credited with the miniskirt. She changed fashion. She revolutionized everything. Asked me if I liked fashion, and I said I did. And she asked me what I thought she should design next. And now you will understand how hilarious this was. I said hoop skirts. I was very into hoop skirts when I was about 4 or 5, and she said that was a wonderful idea. She never did it, though, of course. And Mary's influence is still seen today. Here are some recent runway that obviously draw on the bold, childlike, fun, geometric, playful world of Mary Quant. The fashionable woman wears clothes. The clothes don't wear her, says Mary Quant. What a great quote. I wonder if that applies to hoop skirts. When the mini took off, it took off. There was mini madness. Everybody loved the mini skirt. Because of the mini skirt, tights, which had only been worn by ballet dancers before, suddenly became the hosiery. You cannot wear stockings with a mini skirt. The mini changed everything. It made women feel young. It made them feel sexy. Men loved the mini skirt too. Look at this. It's a dry cleaner's mini skirt shortened. Take your old skirt in. Come out with a sexy new mini. It was fab. Look, Not everybody liked it. Look at this women's clothing shop. We sell diapers for women who wear dresses 6 or 7 inches above the knee. What does that mean? Meaning that if you walk around in a skirt that short, you are going to get yourself pregnant. If the necklines get any lower and the skirts get any higher, you can use the dress for a belt. I am willing to bet that Adele Ross, whoever that was, soon changed her tune, and that 6 months later that window would have been full of mini dresses. Mini skirts forever. Dior unfair to minis. Dior, no, not getting into the mini skirt, and here is a playful protest. In schools, girls had to have their skirts measured every morning to make sure it met regulations, wasn't too short. Look at this airline. Your skirt couldn't be too short to work for PSA, who insisted that all of their staff wear sexy mini skirts with go-go boots. Wow, it was mini madness. Everybody wore minis. Here are some street pictures to prove that everybody embraced the mini skirt. And look at her hair. Wow. A note. Fashion-forward women had abandoned the mini by the late 1960s, and nobody in Europe wore minis in the 70s. Yet mainstream America was so in love with the miniskirt that some retailers were still selling minis as late as 1975. That's only 5 years before the 80s and the miniskirt revival. Let's look at the 60s palette. Needless to say, it was bold, it was fun, it was bright, it was childlike. It was fabulous. It was a rainbow of fun, bold, bright, and babyish colors. But you know what? Where have we seen all this before? I think you know where we've seen it all before. Yes! With its short skirts, bobbed hair, and dark makeup, 60s fashion was paying deliberate homage to 20s fashion, which was also seen as a time of freedom and fun. The 60s were also a time of experimental space-age fashion. Things like this, new materials, plastics, metals. Wow! These are all by a designer called André Courrèges. You should know his name. Take a look at this. It's almost like chainmail, isn't it, with these large paillettes. These two designs are by Paco Rabanne, another very famous designer who embraced youth, newness, new materials, experimentation in fashion. And all of this fab gear was worn perfectly by our mid-60s style icon. This large-eyed, girlish-looking girl, Jane Birkin. Jane Birkin was a British actress. She was very young, very gangly, and very, very pretty. She had the face, the hair, the looks, the body to perfectly wear the fashion look of the era. There she is, looking quite fab and 60s-ish. Look at her long, gangly legs, her big eyes. She really had the look. She was an English actress. She wasn't a very good actress. She never got to be a very good actress. But it didn't matter. It was the way Jane Birkin looked that everybody fell in love with. She was very famous for wearing little baby doll dresses and carrying a big basket, like a little girl playing grown-up lady going to the shop. That was her whole kind of thing. Very little girly. The best thing Jane Birkin ever did was meet this guy. He is called Serge Gainsbourg, but you can say Serge Gainsbourg. He was the biggest star in France, the biggest musical star. He's sort of France's answer to the Beatles and Bob Dylan and Elvis and Frank Sinatra all rolled into one. He had a very long musical career, all the way from the 50s to the 80s, when he died. He died in the early 90s. I think maybe his last album came from the early 90s. He had a very long, eclectic career. He was really a musical genius. He was 20 years older than Jane, but they fell in love, and he made her a big singing star. In France, she couldn't sing either. It didn't matter. They became one of the international it couples of the 1960s, and there she is, making headlines. I told you she was a fashion icon in her famous diaphanous dress there, carrying a basket. The two of them became even more famous when they did something so shocking. They released a single that was banned from every radio station in the world for being too sexy. They were just too sexy. It's really just her panting. But this song, Je t'aime, moi non plus, I love you, me neither, has been sampled a million times. I'm sure if you heard it, you'd recognize it. But of course, it's just added to the notoriety and sexiness and freedom of Jane Birkin. There she is, a little candid shot of Jane Birkin doing some shopping, and you can see she has her basket with her again. And here are Serge and Jane on Rue Saint-Honoré, I think, and she's got her basket. And the reason she always carried a basket around with her all through the 60s and the 70s and the 80s is because she couldn't find a bag that was big enough for all of her crap, she said. And yes, this is why the Birkin bag was designed just for her and called the Birkin bag. Keep smiling, it takes 10 years off. That is a great quote from Jane Birkin, and this is Jane Birkin now, still smiling and still a big star in France. In 1967, the Beatles launched their Sgt. Pepper LP. And this really was a turning point in 60s fashion. The trendier kids moving away from the mod miniskirt or monkey suit look to a style that was all about nostalgia. A nostalgia for the Victorian or Edwardian eras. Moving in at the very end of the decade with a nostalgia for the 1920s and 1930s that would dominate the first couple of years of the 70s. These eras were seen as innocent and peaceful, which in reality they weren't, hello. But moreover, the Victorian and Edwardian eras predated their parents' generation, and remember, these kids blamed their parents for all the wrongs in the world. Look at this. This is a sign for a store, a very famous store. I was Lord Kitchener's valet. It looks Victorian, doesn't it? Lord Kitchener was a Victorian character. It's actually the sign for a really trendy boutique on Portobello Road in London. I love this picture because you can see the girl is still clinging to the mod aesthetic, but her boyfriend there, he is wearing one of those 19th century hussar jackets that we looked at when we did the 19th century. And this is Jimi Hendrix in a cape and a whole ensemble from I Was Lord Kitchener's Valet. So nostalgic, he looks like something out of the Regency era, doesn't he? Granny Takes a Trip. This is another very famous boutique that was operating in London. First of all, think about the title, Granny Takes a Trip. Taking a trip was a euphemism for dropping acid, taking LSD, and then Granny Takes a Trip, nostalgia. Look at the photograph in the window of that 1920s flapper. And then look at the striped blazer and the straw boater that the guy in the front of the picture is wearing. When did we see that before? Do you remember? We saw that in the 1890s. Look at these boots from Granny Takes a Trip. Paisley, William Morris prints from the Victorian era. The back entrance of Granny Takes a Trip featured murals. This is one of them. It's very deco, isn't it? Take a look at this dress. Completely late 60s, but completely nostalgic. It looks like something from the Victorian era, with that paisley print and the high ruffled collar, and of course the length. Look at this. Completely nostalgic, romantic. That actually could even be traced back to the Renaissance, couldn't it? The famous William Morris print jacket. William Morris, of course, the textile and wallpaper designer from the 19th century. His work was re-embraced completely during this little era in the 60s. And look at that incredibly nostalgic coat with paisleys. Remember, we first met the paisley as being one of the big textile motifs of the Victorian era. And this one, of course, has feathers on it. It's completely nostalgic, old-fashioned. It's not mod. This is a fashion image from the late 1960s. Hello, does it remind you of anything? Yes, the Edwardian era with those big cartwheel hats. The cottage loaf came back. Look at this hairdo. And then remind yourselves of those weird, ugly hairdos of the Victorian era. None of this stuff is from the 70s. Don't confuse the 60s with the 70s. This is a poster to the rock venue, the Fillmore Auditorium in San Francisco. Does it remind you of anything? Yeah, that's right. Art Nouveau, the Fillmore artists, who are very famous, were utterly inspired by Art Nouveau. This nostalgia for a world that people just thought was better, more peaceful, more innocent than the one in which they were living. And we all know how much fringed buckskin was a big look of the late 1960s. That first image, Jimi Hendrix, and this interesting young lady, her name is Grace Slick, and she was a rock singer in the band of the Jefferson Airplane from San Francisco, both of them wearing fringed buckskin, which was a nod, an homage to Native American attire. And mustaches. Believe me, when the Beatles grew mustaches, everybody grew mustaches. Mustaches were huge in the late 60s because mustaches were huge in the 1860s. Nostalgia, this is what it's... The cultural hotspot of the late 1960s was a place that very few people went to, but everybody talked about. India. Why India? Because the Beatles went to India. They went to India to study transcendental meditation under this clown here, the Maharishi, who turned out to be a bit of a fraud. I think you're sort of getting a sense, aren't you, that in this turbulent time in the world's history, the young really wanted to escape into the past, escape into their own minds, and as you'll see in a second, escape into drugs. The Beatles escaped to transcendental meditation, and India became a big thing amongst the young and fashionable. There is Paul McCartney of the Beatles wearing an embroidered Indian Nehru jacket. Look at this fashion image. See the girl standing up in the foreground? She is wearing an Afghan jacket. We'll look at the Afghan coat in a minute. Indian prints, but you know what? It doesn't matter if it was from India or Afghanistan, as long as it was somewhere Eastern. That's all that counted. Here are two members of the rock band Pink Floyd. Again, Indian embroidery, Indian patterns, Indian jewelry. Look at this cool fab guy here with his Victorian sideburns, also in this fabulous Nehru jacket. These three are all wearing a version of the famous Afghan coat, and that's what it looked like. Everybody had to have one. Hey, Afghanistan is very near to India. It was all just exotic. These coats were actually kind of disgusting. You went out and got caught in the rain once, and they never dried properly, and they didn't smell very nice, but everybody had to have an Afghan to show that they were in touch, to show that, you know, they were on a very high spiritual level, at least of trendiness. And this, of course, also affected beauty and makeup. I culled this picture of the girl at the very top from a cover of Vogue. So you can see this was embraced by high fashion as well. Many designers in the late 1960s embraced the nostalgic and or Indian and or exotic look. So I'm just going to highlight 3 of them. And they're all British. First up, oh my goodness, look at that. Bill Gibb. It's all going on there, isn't it? I think this is from 69 pushing into 70 possibly, but it's completely the look. It's sort of ethnic Indian, but it's also sort of Regency, it's a bit Victorian. It's just a beautiful eclectic mix of nostalgia. This lady here is called Zandra Rhodes. Take a look at that, floating, romantic. It's hard to pin down any particular era that it is inspired by, or any particular location, just everything coming together in this floating, romantic, nostalgic look. And the couple above there, they were married. He was the designer and she designed the textiles. Like this. Ozzie Clark and Celia Birtwell. 2 names that we really associate with the late 60s, early 70s and this nostalgic look. As I mentioned a few seconds ago, this was an era when people started dropping acid. LSD, a hallucinatory drug, and evidently the effects of acid are sort of pulsating colors. Evidently, if you sort of pick up, I don't know, a pencil and move it in front of your eyes, you see a trail of beautiful colors behind it. I don't know. I have never taken LSD. I never would. I'm crazy enough without drugs. Can you imagine me? I mean, I'm tripping all the time on history, on fashion, on clothes. Have you ever seen somebody get more excited over a medieval sleeve? Imagine me on acid. No, that would be scary. But people did take a lot of acid during the 60s. But those who didn't, not everybody did, those who didn't still embraced the aesthetic of hallucinatory drugs. So just to remind you, when you review, I've written it all out here, as well as escaping the past hallucinatory drugs popularized, of course, by the Beatles, were used by many of the disillusioned young, and even those who never dropped acid embraced the psychedelic fashion inspired by LSD. Like this. Colorful, strange. Like this, lots of swirling patterns, purples, yellows, lime greens, and like this, oh boy, that is one ugly dress. And of course, it was adapted almost instantly by the mainstream as well. This is from an American mail-order catalog, and look at that psychedelic textile on the bodice of that dress. That is a man's shirt from JCPenney, circa 1968. Completely psychedelic. And there is Cher, who we can always count on to embrace the most extreme of any given fashion decade. And we are still psyching out. Here are some recent fashion images that obviously draw from psychedelia of the late 1960s. Gosh. Our style icon for this segment is a woman who utterly embraced the nostalgic and the Eastern themes and made them all her own and influenced a whole lot of people by doing so. This groovy girl here, do you know who she is? She's called Janis Joplin, and she was a singer, a blues and rock singer. and a fabulous talent. As you can see, she was not perhaps the most conventionally pretty girl in the world. She was from Texas, and she had a very difficult upbringing. I think she was quite bullied and picked on when she was in school. Yet she had such a unique and original approach that she transformed herself into something utterly beautiful and unique. Do you see what I mean about Janis embracing and encapsulating this late 60s nostalgic and Eastern mix? Here she is with a Victorian feather boa or an Edwardian feather boa and an Indian vest, and there's Victorian print, and there's all kinds of stuff going on, and of course granny glasses. These are Edwardian granny glasses, glasses like your grandmother wore. Here she is again, completely nostalgic, completely Eastern, a beautiful eclectic mix of both. Sadly, Janis Joplin suffered with a lot of inner demons. She drank an awful lot, far too much, and she did drugs, and she was a bit of a tortured soul, as many rock and roll artists of this era were. And she died very, very suddenly when she was very, very young. But fashion loves Janis Joplin today, and you will often find editorials like these two, which are obviously channeling the original and quite unique Janis Joplin. Don't compare yourself. You're all you've got. That's a wonderful quote from Janis Joplin, and I think that maybe one of the things that made her so happy is that hard as she tried, she probably did compare herself to other people, and yet she was so beautiful and unique she had no reason to. Alright, so what are the boys up to? Throughout the 1960s in England, there was something called the Peacock Revolution. Take a look at him here. He was a British lord. He looks like he stepped out of the Regency era, doesn't he? He could be playing Mr. Darcy in a TV adaptation of Pride and Prejudice. It was a time when men, young men, trendy men, English men, started strutting their stuff and re-embracing the more extreme sides of fashion again for an instant. Colour and bows and nostalgia. Lot going on. Wow, look at his pants with that Victorian / Edwardian motif. Velvets. Cravats. An incredibly colourful and fun time for guys. It wouldn't last long, but some men really enjoyed it while it did. And here is a detail of a suit from the late 1960s. Look at it, really. This could almost come from the Rococo era, couldn't it? And just a little word about male hair in the 1960s. Do you see this haircut here? This is the band, the American folk rock band, The Byrds. You see, it's not quite a mop top, is it? It's a little bit longer at the sides with these very heavy bangs. This was the hairdo of the mid to late 60s, and it has a name. It is called a Prince Valiant haircut. In the 50s, Walt Disney had a TV show that ran called Prince Valiant, where the lead character had a haircut similar to this. It was set in the Middle Ages, and so this generation had grown up watching Prince Valiant, and so they called this haircut the Prince Valiant cut, and we still call it the Prince Valiant cut. Our last style icon of the 60s is this rather handsome young man. His name was Graham Parsons, and he was an American musician, and he is credited with being a pioneer in blending country music with rock music and essentially creating country rock. And there he is in full thrust. He was in a band called the Flying Burrito Brothers, although he also worked with the Byrds. He worked with Emmylou Harris. He was a songwriter. He was obscenely talented. And he had a very iconic look. It was sort of an ironic nod towards Americana. Again, we're with the nostalgia, aren't we? And he is absolutely associated with this particular suit. There it is from the back. It is designed by somebody called Nudie. Nudie Cohen, C-O-H-N, was the full name. Nudie was a menswear designer who primarily designed clothing for country stars and rodeo stars. Nudie himself died in the 80s, but I believe his company is still thriving on that scene. But again, you can see this is all about nostalgia, isn't it? This particular suit features on the album cover here The Gilded Palace of Sin by the Flying Burrito Brothers, where every band member, apart from those two peripheral girls who are not in the band, are wearing a nudie suit. And Graham Parsons' very famous nudie suit lives at the Country Music Hall of Fame. But I want you to look at this close-up and see what exactly this embroidery means. Well, there are poppy flowers there. What comes from poppy flowers? Opium, heroin. It has cannabis leaves on it. It has naked women. It has pills. I don't know, amphetamine pills probably, running down the sleeve. Every element of this flashy suit, apart from the cross on the back, is a reference to drugs or debauchery in some way. It is a very famous suit. It's really quite fab, isn't it? You know how I always like to close the style icons or the fashion icons with a quote, if I can. When I got to Graham Parsons, I thought, I wonder if he has any great quotes. And he has the best fashion quote ever, it turns out. We don't wear sequins because we think we're great. We wear them because we think sequins are great. I love this. You know, we're all in fashion. We all love fashion. And when we dress up, I know that people who don't understand might think, oh, they think they're all that. No, we don't think we're all that. We think fashion is all that. Even though we're all that as well, aren't we? Sadly, this drug-covered suit, or drug-influenced suit, was prophetic because Graham Parsons, as I'm sure you guessed, died of a drug overdose when he was only 26 years of age. But a lovely guy, very sad. Hippies! I know you've been thinking, when the heck is she going to talk about hippies? Well, I'm going to talk about them now, and briefly. Although the boomer-run media has given the impression that everyone under 30 in the 60s was a hippie, this is so far from the truth. To be a real hippie, you had to live by a guy called Dr. Timothy Leary's motto. Dr. Timothy Leary was a university professor who advocated the use of LSD. His motto was turn on, tune in, and drop out, meaning drop out of school, quit your job, drop acid, do a ton of drugs, and live communally on handouts. As you can imagine, very few people actually did this. Going to Woodstock, attending a protest march, and or painting a flower on your face did not make you a hippie. And as far as hippie fashion goes, oh, I hate it when I hear that expression, hippie fashion, because hippies just wore the clothes we've been discussing, the nostalgic or the Eastern styles that every stylish and fashion-conscious young person of the era wore. And remember always, hippies are not from the 70s. Ironically, we are now nostalgic for the 60s being nostalgic. Here are some recent fashion images that you can see completely draw on the 60s nostalgia for earlier times. This is when fashion starts becoming so layered and confusing. Okay, 1970. It looked like the decade might end on a high note in 1969 when we put a man on the moon, but then things went horribly wrong. The Kent State Massacre. This was horrible. A bunch of students were on a peaceful protest. For some reason, the dean of the college decided to bring in the military, and everything went horribly wrong. And 4 young students were killed and another 12 were shot and seriously injured. And the Beatles broke up. I know that doesn't sound very important, but to people living in the 60s who had really lived through that decade, they saw the Beatles as being like their brothers, their family members, their boyfriends. But don't forget, more importantly, the Beatles were the avatars for the 60s. Whatever the Beatles did, everybody else did. Without the Beatles, who were people going to copy? So a decade that started with such optimism ended with such pessimism, cynicism, and a whole lot of heartache. The Vietnam War was still going on. And as we move into the 70s, we're going to see how fashion, of course, as it always does, responded to this new dark world. See you next time.